My name is Margaret Thompson, and this happened to me back in 1963 when I was just 26 years old. Some nights, I still wake up shaking, remembering what I saw in those dark mines of Echo Mountain. But I need to tell this story. People need to know what's up there, waiting in the darkness. I had just run away from my husband, Tom. He wasn't a good man, the kind who used his fists to win arguments. After 6 years of bruises and broken promises, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a small bag one morning while he was at work and just left. I had a little money saved up in a secret account, and I knew I needed to go somewhere he'd never think to look. That's when I found the ad for a cabin rental on Echo Mountain, Colorado. Peaceful mountain getaway, it said. Perfect for writers and artists seeking solitude. The price was cheap, too cheap, I realize now. But back then, it seemed like a gift from heaven. The cabin was old but solid, sitting all alone halfway up the mountain. The nearest town was 2 hours away by car, down a twisting dirt road. I remember standing on the porch that first evening, breathing in the crisp mountain air, feeling truly safe for the first time in years. The sunset painted the sky orange and purple, and the pine trees swayed in the wind like they were welcoming me. But that feeling didn't last long. That very first night, I heard it, a sound like someone crying, echoing up from somewhere in the mountain. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The sound had words in it, whispered words I couldn't quite make out. And sometimes, when I looked out my bedroom window at night, I could swear I saw lights moving in the old mine entrance down the slope. I should have left right then, should have gotten in my car and never looked back. But I had nowhere else to go. And anyway, by the time I realized what was really happening in Echo Mountain, it was already too late. It started with the old newspapers I found in the cabin's basement. I was cleaning up down there, trying to make the place feel more like home when I discovered a dusty cardboard box filled with yellow papers. Most of them were from the 1890s, and at first, I didn't think much of them. But then a headline caught my eye. 47 miners missing, no bodies found. I sat there on the cold basement floor, reading article after article by candlelight. The basement had no electricity. The story was horrible. Back in 1891, 47 miners went into Echo Mountain's main shaft for their regular shift. None of them ever came out. The search parties found their tools, their lunch pails, even their boots, but no bodies. It was like they had just vanished. That night, the crying sounds from the mountain seemed louder, and now I could almost make out words. Help us. Please help us. I tried to ignore it. During the day, I kept myself busy fixing up the cabin and writing in my journal. But strange things started happening more and more. My coffee cup would move when I wasn't looking. Muddy boot prints would appear on the clean floor, big prints like from old mining boots. And every morning, the chair by my window would be turned to face the mine entrance, even though I always left it facing the room. Then I found the other box. This one was hidden behind a loose board in the pantry. Inside was a leather-bound journal belonging to someone named Frank Miller. The first page had a warning written in shaky handwriting. If you're reading this, get out. The mine hungers. It needs sacrifices. I tried to feed it, but it's never enough. As I read on, my hands started shaking. Miller wrote about hikers who would come up the mountain, 23 of them over the years, how they'd go missing near the mine, how the crying would stop for a while after each disappearance, how he'd help lead them there, knowing what would happen. I slammed the journal shut and ran upstairs. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold, fresh muddy boot prints leading from my front door to my bedroom. And they weren't mine. I followed them slowly, my heart pounding. They led to my closet. With trembling hands, I opened the door. Inside, my clothes had been pushed aside, and there on the wall behind them, someone or something had scratched 3 words into the wood. Hecoingaone. I knew exactly what it meant. Tom had found me, but now I wasn't sure what scared me more, my husband or whatever was waiting in that mine. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept thinking about those miners who vanished, about the missing hikers, and about Tom. I knew I should leave, but something kept me there. Maybe it was having nowhere else to go, or maybe it was something darker, pulling me to stay. The next morning, I gathered my courage and did something I knew was stupid. I went to look at the mine entrance. The old wooden boards that used to block it were broken and scattered on the ground. The opening was like a black mouth in the mountainside, and cold air rushed out of it, carrying a smell like old pennies and wet dirt. That's when I saw them, old mining tools scattered near the entrance, partly buried in dirt. They looked ancient, but the weird thing was, they weren't rusty. They were clean, like someone had just been using them. I picked up a lantern that was sitting there. It still had oil in it, which made no sense, and took a few steps into the mine. The walls were wet and black, and my footsteps echoed in a strange way, like someone was walking behind me. 20 feet in, my lantern light hit something on the ground. I thought it was a pile of old clothes at first, but when I got closer, I realized what I was looking at: bodies. 3 of them, dried out like mummies, wearing modern hiking clothes. They must have been some of Milder's victims. I turned to run, but the crying sound started again. Only this time it wasn't coming from deeper in the mine. It was coming from behind me, from the entrance. I spun around and saw something that made me drop the lantern. There were people standing at the mine entrance, at least a dozen of them. But they weren't really people, not anymore. They were transparent, like fog shaped into human forms. They wore old mining clothes, and their faces were twisted in pain. One of them pointed at me and spoke in a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Another offering comes, but not for us. Not yet. The mountain wants him first." They faded away like smoke, leaving me alone in the darkness. I ran back to the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind me. But locks wouldn't help me now, because right there on my kitchen table was a fresh cup of coffee. And next to it was Tom's favorite mug, the one he always drank from back home. He wasn't just coming, he was already here. But somehow, deep down, I knew the mountain had plans for him. The same plans it had for those miners all those years ago. The same plans it had for Milder's hikers. The mountain was hungry, and Tom was going to be its next meal. I should have felt scared or guilty, but sitting there, looking at his coffee mug, all I felt was a strange sort of calm. Maybe, just maybe, the mountain and I could help each other. I heard his truck before I saw it, the engine roaring up the mountain road. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my coffee cup. Then came the heavy footsteps on the porch and his fist pounding on the door. "Margaret," Tom's voice was thick with anger. "Open this door right now." I stayed quiet, but it didn't matter. He had his own ways of getting in. The sound of breaking glass came from the kitchen window, and then he was inside. Tom looked exactly like I remembered, tall, broad-shouldered, with those cold blue eyes that could switch from charming to cruel in a second. He had a cut on his hand from the window, and blood dripped onto my clean kitchen floor. "Did you really think you could hide from me up here?" he growled, moving closer. "Nobody hides from me, Maggie. Nobody." But something was different this time. The fear I usually felt around him was still there, but there was something else too. I could feel the mountain watching through every window, waiting. "You shouldn't have come here, Tom," I said quietly. "This place, it's not safe." He laughed, that mean laugh I knew so well. "Safe? You're worried about me being safe." He grabbed my arm, hard enough to bruise. "Let me show you what's not safe." That's when the crying started. Not from the mine this time, from everywhere. It filled the cabin like smoke, and Tom's grip on my arm loosened as he looked around, confused. "What's that sound?" His voice had lost its edge. "What kind of trick is this?" The cups on the table started to shake. The lights flickered, and there behind Tom, I saw them forming, the ghost miners, their transparent bodies glowing with a sickly light. Tom spun around and his face went white. He let go of me completely, backing away. "What? What is this?" "The mountain's hungry, Tom," I heard myself say. "And you're just its type." He ran. Of course he ran. They always run to the mine. Frank Miller's journal said so. The mountain makes them run there, like a spider drawing flies into its web. I followed at a distance, watching as Tom stumbled down the path toward the mine entrance. The ghost miners floated alongside him, herding him like sheepdogs. His screams echoed off the mountainside as he realized where his feet were taking him, but he couldn't stop running. I stood at the top of the path and watched as the darkness of the mine swallowed him whole. Then the real screaming started. I shouldn't have followed the screams. I should have run away and never looked back, but I had to see, had to know what the mountain was doing to Tom. The mine entrance seemed bigger now, like a giant mouth open wide. Tom's screams bounced off the walls, getting louder as I walked deeper into the darkness. I didn't need a light. The ghost miners glowed just enough to show the way, floating beside me like cold blue street lamps. I found Tom in a big cave deep underground. He was on his knees, but something was holding him there. Black shapes like ropes made of shadow wrapped around his arms and legs. When he saw me, his eyes were different. Not angry anymore, just scared. "Maggie, please," he whispered. "Help me." But then I saw something that made me step back. The walls of the cave were moving. What I thought was just wet rock was actually shifting and flowing, like thick black oil, and faces started forming in it. The faces of the missing miners, the lost hikers, all of them trapped in the living rock of the mountain. The black ropes holding Tom started to pull, not to drag him away. They were pulling him apart. His screams turned into sounds I didn't know a human could make. I won't describe what happened next. I can't. But I watched it all, and I didn't look away once. When it was over, the black ropes melted back into the wall, taking what was left of Tom with them. For a moment, I saw his face form in the rock wall, his mouth open in a silent scream, before it faded away like all the others. One of the ghost miners floated up to me. His face was sad but kind. "The mountain is satisfied," he said, "for now. But it will hunger again when the moon is full. It always does." I walked back to the cabin in a daze. Inside, I found Tom's coffee mug was gone, like he'd never been there at all. But there was a new piece of paper on the table, a deed to the cabin, with my name on it. The mountain had given me a home, in exchange for giving it Tom. I still live here on Echo Mountain. Every full moon, I hear the cries start again. Sometimes hikers come by, asking for directions or a place to stay. Good people, most of them. I send them back down the mountain. But sometimes someone not so good shows up. Someone mean. Someone who reminds me of Tom. Those people I invite in for coffee, and I wait for the cries to begin. After all, the mountain needs to eat, and I need to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. Up here, I can do both. So if you're ever hiking on Echo Mountain and you come across my cabin, pay attention to the way I look at you. If I invite you in for coffee, think carefully about what kind of person you've been, because the mountain knows. The mountain always knows. My name is Elizabeth Foster, and this happened to me in the summer of 1977. I never thought I'd tell anyone about what I found on my family's old farm in New Mexico, but some secrets are too heavy to carry alone. It started when my grandfather died and left me the family property, a sprawling 200-acre farm that everyone called Devil's Acre. I remember thinking the name was just one of those old country superstitions. How wrong I was. The first thing that struck me as odd was how different our land looked compared to the farms around it. While our neighbors struggled with dry, cracked soil, our fields were rich and dark, with corn stalks taller than I'd ever seen. The tomatoes grew fat and red, and the wheat swayed golden in the breeze. It was like someone had drawn a line in the dirt. On our side, everything thrived. On theirs, everything struggled. I moved into the old farmhouse that June. It was the kind of place that creaked when you walked and whispered when the wind blew. My first few nights there, I kept waking up to strange sounds, not the usual house-settling noises, but something that sounded almost like singing coming from deep in the ground. Then one morning, while cleaning out the basement, I found it. Behind an old shelf that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades, there was a door. Not the kind of door you'd expect in a basement. This one was made of thick, black wood with strange symbols carved into it. The key was hanging on a rusty nail right next to it, like it had been waiting for me. I probably should have left it locked. That's what normal people would do, right? But something pulled at me, like a hook behind my belly button. drawing me toward whatever was hidden behind that door. The key turned with a sound like bones breaking. Inside, I found a room that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The walls were lined with old leather journals, hundreds of them, dating back to 1827. But it was what sat on the center table that made my blood run cold. A book bound in something that didn't look like any leather I'd ever seen, with a name I recognized stamped in fading gold letters. Cooper Foster's Record of the Harvest. Cooper Foster, my great-great-grandfather, the man who first owned this land. I picked up the book with shaking hands, and as I opened it, a single piece of paper fluttered to the floor. It was a list of names and dates, hundreds of them, spanning back 150 years. At the bottom of the page, in fresh ink, was a note that made my heart stop. The land hungers. Harvest comes soon. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my grandfather's old study with Cooper's journal in my lap, a cup of cold coffee beside me. My hands trembled as I read the first entry, dated May 15, 1827. The land was dead when we arrived. Nothing would grow. My children were starving, and Sarah was getting weaker each day. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought I was going crazy from hunger, but the voice in the soil was real. It made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I had to stop reading for a moment. The way Cooper wrote, it felt so normal, like he was talking about the weather or discussing farm equipment. But what came next made me feel sick to my stomach. The traveler was headed to Santa Fe. Nobody would miss him, the voice said, and it was right. After it was done, I spread the blood on the corner posts of the property. Within days, the corn sprouted. In a week, it was knee-high. Sarah stopped asking questions when the food became plenty. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the journal. I got up and looked out the window at our fields, beautiful in the moonlight. How many times had I played in that soil as a kid? How many family picnics had we had under those trees? Cooper's entries continued, getting worse with each page. He created a system, him and 4 other local farmers. They'd take turns watching the roads, looking for people who wouldn't be missed, travelers, wanderers, people running from something. They made it seem like they were offering shelter for the night. The numbers made me sick. Every harvest season for 150 years, 3 or 4 people each time, all to keep the land fertile, all to keep the crops growing. But it was the details about the land itself that really got to me. Cooper wrote about how the soil would bubble and shift when they performed their rituals. How sometimes, late at night, you could hear the earth humming, like it was singing some horrible lullaby. He wrote about how the bodies didn't decay. They just disappeared, absorbed into the ground like water. I closed the journal and went to the kitchen for more coffee. That's when I heard it, the same humming sound Cooper had written about, coming from somewhere deep beneath the house. And worse it sounded, hungry. Standing there in my dark kitchen, listening to that sound, I realized something terrible. The last sacrifice had been 3 months ago, when my grandfather died. According to the journal, the land needed feeding every harvest season, and harvest season was just 2 weeks away. I looked at the calendar on the wall, the one Grandpa had always kept in the kitchen. There were little red X marks on certain days throughout the year. I used to think they were planting dates. Now I knew better. The next morning, I drove to the local library. I had to know if Cooper's journal was telling the truth. The librarian, Mrs. Martinez, knew my family. She'd known all the Fosters. When I asked about old newspaper records, something flickered in her eyes. "Looking into family history, Elizabeth?" she asked, her voice shaky. She was gripping her desk so hard her knuckles turned white. I nodded, and she led me to a back room filled with old newspapers. "Be careful what you dig up," she whispered, then practically ran away. Hour after hour, I went through old papers. My hands got dusty and my eyes hurt, but what I found was worse than any nightmare. Every harvest season, like clockwork, people went missing near our farm. The papers called our road the Vanishing Mile. Police never found anything, never had any leads. Back at the farm, I started walking the property with Cooper's journal as my guide. According to his writings, there were 4 special spots, one in each corner of the farm. When I found the first marker, I almost threw up. It looked like a normal fence post, old and wooden, but carved into it were tiny symbols, the same ones from the basement door. The ground around it was different too, softer, almost spongy. When I pressed down with my foot, I swear I felt it push back. That's when old Bill Tucker, our nearest neighbor, came walking up. He was in his 70s and had lived next door my whole life. "Your grandpa told me you'd be coming," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Told me you'd probably start looking around." "Did you know?" I asked. My voice sounded small, even to me. "All these years, did you know?" Bill looked at the ground. "We all knew. Had to know. Had to keep quiet. Your family's farm. It feeds the whole county. Best crops for 100 miles. Even in drought years." He looked up at me finally. "Sometimes good things grow from bad soil, Elizabeth." I backed away from him. "People died, Bill. Hundreds of people. And thousands lived because of it. Your grandfather, he hated it too at first. But he understood. You will too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "He left this for you. Said to give it to you when you started asking questions." I took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. "Dear Elizabeth, by now you know our secret. The land has to be fed. It's been this way since Cooper's time. I tried to stop it once, back in '55. The crops died. People started starving. Children got sick. And the land, it started taking people itself. Random folks. Kids sometimes. At least with the ritual, we can choose. Make it quick. Choose people who won't be missed. The harvest is coming. You're a foster. You know what needs to be done. I'm sorry. Love. Grandpa." As I read the last words, a sound came from the ground beneath my feet, a low, hungry growl that seemed to shake the earth itself. Bill just nodded sadly and walked away, leaving me alone with my family's horrible legacy and a decision I never wanted to make. That evening it rained. Not normal rain. The drops were heavy and dark, almost black. The sound they made hitting the roof was like fingers drumming, waiting impatiently. I knew I had to find where they did it, where the rituals happened. Cooper's journal mentioned a clearing behind the old barn. I took a flashlight and my grandfather's old spade. The mud sucked at my boots as I walked, like it was trying to pull me down. When I reached the clearing, I knew I was in the right place. The grass grew in a perfect circle here, deep green despite the darkness. In the center was a flat stone about the size of a dinner table. I started digging near the stone. The ground was surprisingly soft, like it wanted me to dig. 3 feet down, I found the first thing. A silver watch, old style, its hands frozen at midnight. Next came a shoe, then buttons, bits of cloth, but no bones. Never any bones. Then my spade hit something hard. Wiping away the mud, I found a metal box, sealed tight but not rusted. Inside were hundreds of small items: wedding rings, wallets, old ID cards, driver's licenses. My family had kept a record of every person they'd sacrificed. The most recent items were from just months ago. As I knelt there in the mud, looking at these pieces of stolen lives, something moved under the ground. Not like an animal or a root, more like the earth itself was shifting. The flat stone in the center of the clearing started to hum, the same sound I heard in the kitchen. That's when I saw the pictures. Hidden at the bottom of the box was a stack of old photographs. The first one showed my grandfather as a young man, standing with other men around the stone. The next showed my father, just a teenager, watching from the edge of the clearing. The last one hit me hardest. Me, maybe 5 years old, sitting on my grandfather's shoulders during what I thought was just a normal harvest celebration. We'd all been part of it, even when we didn't know it. I was about to close the box when a piece of paper caught my eye. It was newer than the rest, written in my grandfather's handwriting just before he died. The land knows its own. It chose us, the Fosters, generations ago. We don't just keep the ritual keeps us. Try to leave, and it pulls you back. Try to stop, and it takes what it wants anyway. The only choice we have is how we do it. The humming from the stone got louder. The ground around me started to feel like it was breathing. And then, in the beam of my flashlight, I saw something that made my heart stop. The mud was moving, forming shapes that looked almost like hands, reaching up from below. I ran all the way back to the house, clutching that box of memories from people who'd never left our farm. But even inside, with all the doors locked, I could still hear it, that hungry humming coming from deep in the earth. And I knew, with a certainty that made me sick, that I had only 1 week left until harvest time. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, spending my nights going through old family albums with new eyes. Every smiling photo, every holiday gathering, every harvest celebration, they all looked different now. In one Christmas picture, I noticed a strange mark on my father's arm, the same symbols from the basement door tattooed into the skin. Then I found my grandmother's diary hidden in the attic. Her words made everything clearer, and so much worse. "It's not just our land," she wrote. "The Fosters aren't just farmers, we're keepers. The land chose us because we were strong enough to do what needed to be done. Every foster child is marked at birth. The land knows its own." With shaking hands, I checked my left ankle, where I'd always had a strange birthmark. Looking at it now, under a magnifying glass, I could see it wasn't random spots. It was tiny symbols, just like the ones on the door, on the posts, on my father's arm. That night, I got a visit I'll never forget. Bill Tucker came back, but he wasn't alone. 5 other farmers from the county were with him. They sat at my kitchen table, these men I'd known all my life, and told me the rest of the story. "Your grandfather was our leader," Bill said softly. "Like his father before him, and all the way back to Cooper. The Foster family doesn't just keep their own land fertile. You keep all our lands alive too. When you do the ritual right, we all benefit. When you don't, the drought of '55, another farmer, Tom Wilson, added. When your grandfather tried to stop, it wasn't just crops that died. Remember all those accidents that year? The kids who got sick. The land took what it wanted anyway. At least with the ritual, we can choose. Make it quick. Keep it away from our families." My hands were shaking as I poured more coffee. "How many families?" I asked. "How many farms depend on this?" 27 farms, Bill answered. "Over 100 families, thousands of people if you count all the folks who eat what we grow. This isn't just about us anymore, Elizabeth. It's about everyone in the county." They left me with a book, a listing of every foster who'd ever been keeper of the land. Next to each name were numbers, how many years they served, how many sacrifices they oversaw, how many lives they saved through keeping the farms alive. The last entry was my grandfather's name. Below it was a blank space, waiting for mine. As they walked out, Bill turned back one last time. "Harvest moon's in 6 days," he said. "The land will need feeding. If you don't choose someone, it'll choose for itself. And it doesn't care about being kind." That night, the humming from the ground was louder than ever. Standing at my kitchen window, I watched the corn stalks swaying without any wind. In the distance, at each corner of the property, the marker posts were glowing with a faint, sickly light. And somewhere on the highway nearby, cars full of travelers were passing by, unaware they were driving past what my family had turned into a hunting ground for generations. I had less than a week to make my choice. The night of the harvest moon came too fast. All day, the ground had been trembling. The corn in the fields whispered without wind, and the sky turned a strange, sickly yellow. I hadn't made my choice yet. Or maybe I had, and I just couldn't admit it to myself. Around sunset, I heard the first scream. It came from the north corner of the property. When I ran out there, I found a teenage girl, maybe 16. Her car broken down on the road. She was staring at the ground, terrified, as the soil moved around her feet like quicksand, trying to pull her in. I knew then what my grandfather meant. If I didn't choose, the land would take who it wanted. "Run," I shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling. The ground fought back, but I managed to drag her free. I got her to her car, used some tricks my grandfather taught me to fix it quickly, and made sure she drove away. But the land wasn't happy. The humming turned into a roar. Cracks started appearing in the soil, spreading like spider webs across the property. From the old barn, I could hear wood splintering as the ground shifted. The ritual stone in the clearing started glowing with a horrible red light. That's when I made my decision. I walked to the center of the property, Cooper's journal in one hand, my grandfather's letter in the other. The ground was practically alive now, moving like waves on an ocean. But I didn't run. "You want a sacrifice?" I yelled at the land. Fine, but this time I make the rules. I took out a knife, the same one my family had used for generations, and made a cut across my palm. My blood dripped onto the ground, and instantly, everything went quiet. In that silence, I made a new deal. You can have my blood, I said, a little bit, every day, freely given, but no more killings, no more travelers, no more families wondering what happened to their loved ones. The ground trembled, like it was considering my offer. Then slowly the cracks began to heal. The roaring stopped. The horrible red light faded. But I knew it wasn't over. I was now bound to this land in a new way. Every morning at sunrise, I have to go to each corner of the property and give a few drops of blood. It's not much, but it keeps the land satisfied. The crops still grow. The other farms still benefit. But no one else has to die. Sometimes late at night, I still hear the humming. It's not as hungry now, but it's not happy either. The land took my offering, but I know it wanted more, will always want more. I started teaching my daughter about the land, not about the old ways, but about the new deal I made. She'll have to decide for herself when her time comes. Maybe she'll find an even better way. But at least now, when I look at my fields, I don't see graves anymore. I see hope. And if the price for that hope is a few drops of my own blood every day, well, that's a price I'm willing to pay. The Foster family will always be keepers of this land. But now we keep it our way. And every time I see a car pass by on that road, every time I see the crops feed a hungry family, I know I made the right choice. Even if sometimes, in my dreams, I still hear the land whispering, hungry for the old ways. My name is Harold Mitchell, and this happened to me back in 1972, when I took a job that would change my life forever. I was 26 then, young and eager to get away from the busy city life. When I saw the job posting for a fire tower watcher in the remote mountains of Idaho, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. 6 months of peaceful solitude, watching for forest fires, and getting paid for it seemed like a dream come true. Boy, was I wrong. I still remember the day I first arrived at Crow's Keep Fire Tower. The ranger who drove me up there, Rick, was oddly quiet during the whole 2-hour drive through winding mountain roads. When we finally reached the base of the tower, he just handed me the keys, mumbled something about following the manual, and left in such a hurry you'd think the devil was chasing him. The tower itself was pretty much what you'd expect. A tall steel structure rising above the pine trees, with a small cabin on top where I'd be living. But something felt off right from the start. Maybe it was the unusual number of crows perched on the railings, watching me with their beady black eyes. Or maybe it was the strange symbols carved into the wooden steps leading up to the cabin. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that the isolation was already getting to me. That first night, as I was unpacking my things and trying to make the small cabin feel like home, I found an old leather-bound journal tucked away in one of the drawers. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellow with age. On the first page, written in shaky handwriting, were the words, "To whoever finds this, I'm sorry. They won't let you leave now. The boundary must be maintained." I should have left right then, but curiosity got the better of me, and that's where my story really begins. That first week was pretty normal, just doing my job watching for fires and reporting weather conditions. But the crows, they kept growing in number. Every morning, there'd be more of them. They'd sit there in perfect circles around the tower, just watching, not making a sound, not flying away when I shouted at them, just watching. One rainy evening, when the crows finally flew off for the night, I decided to really read through that journal I found. It belonged to a man named Tom Cooper, the tower's watcher from 1968. His first entries were ordinary enough, daily logs about weather and forest conditions. But then things got weird. Day 47, he wrote. They took another one today. I watched from the tower as the crows swarmed around some poor hiker who'd wandered too close. When they cleared, there was nothing left but footprints in the dirt. That makes 154 people since this tower was built. I've been keeping count from all the previous watchers' journals. My hands started shaking. I found more journals hidden under the floorboards, 6 of them, each from a different watcher. Every single one told the same story: people disappearing, crows gathering, and something about maintaining some kind of boundary. The oldest journal was from 1922, written by a forest ranger named Frank Miller. His last entry gave me chills. The local Native Americans warned us never to build here. They said this mountain was a gateway, that the ancient ones used it for spirit ceremonies. The crows aren't just birds, they're guardians, and they need to be fed. I started noticing things I hadn't before: the strange symbols on the stairs. They matched the ones drawn in Miller's journal, old tribal markings meant to keep something in, or maybe out. At night, I could see strange lights moving through the trees, following paths that Miller had marked as ley lines on his maps. One morning, I tried calling for a replacement on my radio. That's when I heard them, hundreds of crows, all cawing at once. The sound was so loud it shattered my radio's screen. Their message was clear: I wasn't going anywhere. I know how this sounds, but I swear every word is true. And what happened next? That's when things got really scary. After my radio broke, I knew I needed to understand what was really going on. In Frank Miller's journal, he mentioned talking to a Native American elder from the local tribe. By pure luck, I found a folded map tucked into his journal, showing the location of their old settlement. I waited for a clear day when the crows seemed calmer. They always got restless around sunset, so I chose early morning to make my move. It took me 2 hours to climb down the tower and hike to the old settlement site. The whole time, I could feel eyes watching me from the trees. What I found there changed everything. The settlement was long gone, but there was a cave nearby with paintings on the walls. They showed the same things, over and over: people turning into crows, a tall structure like my tower, and lines of energy running through the mountain. An old wooden sign near the cave entrance read, "Sacred Site, Boundary Between Worlds." Below it, someone had carved numbers into the wood, a count that ended at 156, the same number of victims the tower watchers had written about. While I was studying the cave paintings, I met Joseph, an old man who turned out to be from the local tribe. He'd been watching me from the moment I arrived. Instead of telling me to leave, he sat down and shared a story that had been passed down through his people for generations. "This mountain," he said, his voice quiet but strong, "is where the spirit world touches ours. Long ago, my ancestors helped keep the boundary strong through sacred ceremonies. The crows were our partners, guardians who watched over the gateway. But when your people built that tower, right on our sacred site, it broke something. Now the crows must take people to maintain the boundary, or something much worse will break through." I asked him about the strange lines of light I'd seen. He called them ley lines, ancient paths of power that ran through the earth. The tower, he said, had been built right where several of these lines crossed, making it a powerful spot. But that power came with a price. The tower watchers, Joseph told me, they're not just watching for fires. They're witnesses. The crows need witnesses to their work, or the magic doesn't hold. As he finished speaking, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold: wings. Hundreds of wings getting closer. Joseph's eyes went wide with fear. "Get back to your tower," he whispered. "They're coming, and they're hungry." I ran all the way back, my heart pounding. Now I knew the truth, but that knowledge didn't make me any safer. If anything, it made things worse, because I knew what was coming next, and I couldn't stop it. The next few days were the hardest of my life. The crows were everywhere now, their black wings blocking out the sun. I counted them once from my tower window, at least 300 of them, and they were acting stranger than ever. One morning, I woke up to find them arranged in perfect circles on the ground, each circle bigger than the last. In the center of each circle was a small object: a shoe, a backpack, a broken watch. I realized with horror that these were belongings of the people they'd taken. Then the hikers came. It was a group of 23 people who'd wandered off the main trail. I tried to warn them. I grabbed my megaphone and shouted for them to turn back, that it wasn't safe. But no sound came out. The crows had somehow silenced everything around the tower. I watched helplessly as the hikers got closer. They seemed confused, like they weren't sure how they'd gotten there. Some of them were pointing at the tower, others at the strange circles of crows. I could see their mouths moving, probably asking each other what was going on, but I couldn't hear a thing. The lights started changing then. Those ley lines Joseph had told me about began glowing beneath the earth, forming a web of bright blue light that connected all the crow circles. The hikers were standing right in the middle of it all. I grabbed my binoculars to get a better look, and what I saw made my hands shake. Black feathers were starting to grow from the hikers' arms. Their eyes were turning dark and shiny, like polished stones. They weren't screaming, though. They just stood there, swaying slightly as if in a trance. The crows started moving, flying in tight circles around the hikers, faster and faster. The blue light from the ley lines got brighter and brighter. I couldn't look away. I had to watch. Just like all the tower watchers before me, I had to be the witness. I grabbed Frank Miller's journal and started writing everything down as fast as I could. The transformation had begun, and I knew that once it was over, I'd be the only one left to tell the story. Through my tears, I wrote, "They're changing. God help me, they're changing. The boundary must be maintained, and I'm the one who has to watch it happen. What happened next will haunt me forever." The blue light from the ground grew so bright it hurt my eyes. But I couldn't stop watching. I had to witness it all. That's what the Tower Watcher's duty really was. The 23 hikers were completely surrounded by swirling crows now. Their bodies started changing faster. Their fingers stretched into wing feathers. Their faces grew sharp and black like beaks. Some of them tried to run, but the circles of crows kept them trapped. The blue light wrapped around them like ropes, holding them in place. Then I heard it, a sound that was half human scream, half crow's call. It came from all of them at once as their bodies twisted and changed. Their clothes fell away, replaced by sleek black feathers. Their eyes glowed with the same blue light that came from the ground. I wrote everything in the journal with shaking hands. The boundary is being fed. 23 more guardians are being made. This is sacrifice number 157 through 179. The worst part wasn't watching them change. It was seeing the look in their eyes when they realized what was happening. For just a moment, before they fully transformed, they all looked up at my tower. In their faces, I saw that they understood everything. They knew why this was happening, and they knew they'd be here forever, guarding this cursed place just like all the others. The whole thing took maybe 5 minutes. When it was over, where there had been 23 people, now there were 23 new crows. But they weren't like regular crows. They were bigger, with eyes that glowed blue in the dark. They still moved like people sometimes, standing too straight, turning their heads in too human ways. The new crows joined the circles of their brothers and sisters. The blue light faded back into the ground. Everything got quiet again, but it was a heavy kind of quiet, full of sadness and secrets. I slumped down in my chair, the journal clutched to my chest. I just watched people turn into crows. I was now part of this dark magic, this ancient duty. The tower, the crows, the boundary between worlds, it was all real, and I was trapped in the middle of it. It's been 2 months since that terrible day. The new crow people are always there now, watching me just like the others. Sometimes at night, I see them doing human things, trying to walk on 2 legs, or making shapes with their wings that look like they're reaching out to someone. It breaks my heart every time. Last week, I finally found the courage to read the last pages of Frank Miller's journal from 1922. What I read made everything click into place. He wrote about finding strange machinery hidden in the tower's walls, old copper pipes and crystal wheels that lined up perfectly with the ley lines below. The tower wasn't built here by accident. Someone knew about the boundary and built this place to harness its power. Miller's final entry chilled me to the bone. May God forgive me, but I've become part of it now. The crows spoke to me today. They showed me the future. All the watchers who would come after me, all the sacrifices that would be needed. I saw the final transformation, the day when the boundary will need its biggest feeding. When that day comes, the Tower Watcher himself must join the flock. I'm writing this now because I know my time is running short. This morning, I found black feathers in my bed. My reflection in the mirror shows my eyes starting to change, getting darker and shinier. The crows are watching me differently now, like they're waiting. The boundary between worlds is getting weaker. I can feel it. The ley lines glow brighter every night, and the crows are getting restless. They need one more sacrifice, a willing one this time. A watcher who understands their duty. To whoever finds this journal, the tower will need a new watcher soon. The crows will make sure of that. But at least now you know the truth. At least you'll understand what happened to me and all the others. I can hear wings beating against my window as I write these last words. They're calling me to join them. And you know what? I'm not even scared anymore. This is my duty now. The boundary must be maintained. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. Just another crow watching over this cursed place. But the tower still stands, and it still needs its witness. The boundary must be maintained. Always. My name is Paul Anderson, and this happened to me last year when I was working as a forest investigator in Washington State. I've been doing this job for 15 years, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I found in the Whispering Pines forest. It started with a simple missing persons report. Some hikers had disappeared in the area, and my boss sent me to check it out. Pretty normal stuff for us, or at least that's what I thought. The locals kept telling me to stay away from the old logging camp in the forest. They said the place was cursed, but I'd heard stories like that before. Every small town has its spooky legends, right? The day I drove out there was foggy, which wasn't unusual for Washington, but something felt different. The trees seemed to lean over the road, like they were watching me. I know how that sounds, but I swear their branches looked like fingers reaching down. I parked my truck at the old camp entrance and started looking around. The place was a mess, broken equipment everywhere, old cabins falling apart, and these weird twisted trees growing right through some of the buildings. But what really caught my eye was this old office building that was still standing. Inside, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were these dusty old records, all neatly stacked on a desk like someone had just left them there yesterday. They talked about strange things happening at the camp back in 1988. Workers going missing. People hearing whispers in the forest. And then I saw the numbers. 89 loggers had vanished without a trace. But that wasn't even the creepiest part. As I was reading through the papers, I heard something outside. It sounded like, well, you know when you step on dry leaves. Imagine that sound, but it was all around the building, like the forest itself was walking. I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. That's when I noticed the roots. They weren't normal tree roots. They were moving. Not fast, but slow and steady, like veins pulsing under the ground. And scattered among them were things that looked horribly like human bones. My hands were shaking as I took pictures with my phone. I'm a trained investigator, but this was different. Something was very wrong in these woods, and I had a feeling I was about to find out just how wrong. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. Those reports I found, they were going to lead me to discover something much worse. Something about a massive logging camp massacre, a family's dark secrets, and a forest that was very, very hungry. Would you like me to continue with the next part? I can tell you about what I discovered about the massacre that changed everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, so I stayed up reading through the old reports. What I found made me wish I'd never opened those files. It happened on October 15, 1988. The camp was full that night, 230 workers sleeping in their bunks after a long day of cutting trees. According to the only survivor, Jack Mills, everything was normal until midnight. That's when the screaming started. I found Jack's statement in the files. His hands were shaking so bad that some words were hard to read, but I'll never forget what he wrote. I woke up to Tommy yelling in the bunk below me. When I looked down, the floorboards, they were moving. Like snakes made of wood, they were wrapping around people's legs. And the walls, the wooden walls were reaching in. I saw Bill try to run, but the door frame grabbed him. Just grabbed him like it had hands. I only got out because I was by the window and jumped. Jack's story got worse. He said he hid in his truck and watched the whole thing. The wooden cabin seemed to come alive, crushing inward like giant mouths. The trees around the camp bent down, their branches dragging people up into the darkness. But the worst part, the ground itself was moving, with roots bursting up through the dirt, pulling people under. By sunrise, when help finally arrived, the camp was empty. All 230 people were just gone. The only signs of what happened were some torn clothes, a few bloodstains, and deep holes in the ground where the roots had pushed through. The official report called it a landslide, but I knew better now. The evidence was right in front of me. Photos of twisted tree trunks with shapes that looked too much like human faces, root systems that formed patterns like human bones, and soil samples that contained traces of human blood. As I read this, sitting alone in my motel room, something caught my eye. Through the window, I could see the trees at the edge of the parking lot. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I swear one of them moved, just a little, even though there wasn't any wind. I needed to know more. The reports mentioned something about a local family, the Fosters. They'd lived near these woods for generations, and according to the old-timers, they knew things about the forest that nobody else did. Tomorrow, I decided I would find out what the Foster family knew about all this. Looking back now, I wish I'd just packed up and left that night, but I didn't. And what I learned about the Foster family the next day, that's when things got really scary. The next morning, I drove to the local library to learn more about the Foster family. The librarian, an older lady with kind eyes, got real quiet when I mentioned their name. She led me to a back room and pulled out a dusty box filled with old journals. "These belong to Sarah Foster," she whispered. "She brought them here a week before she disappeared in 1989. Made me promise to keep them safe." I spent hours reading those journals, and with each page, I felt my hands getting colder. The Foster family have lived next to Whispering Pines for over 100 years, and they had a terrible secret. According to Sarah's writings, the forest wasn't just a bunch of trees. It was alive, really alive, and it was always hungry. The Fosters had made a deal with it back in the 1800s. They would bring the forest what it needed, one person every month. In return, the forest would leave their family alone. Sarah wrote about how her grandfather would lure travelers to their house near the woods. They'd offer them dinner and a place to sleep, but those people never left. The forest took them through the night. But in 1988, something changed. "The forest is angrier now," Sarah wrote in her last entry. "One person a month isn't enough anymore. It wants more, so much more. I can hear it at night, whispering through the leaves. It's saying terrible things, I think. I think it's because of the logging camp. They've been cutting too deep, hurting too many trees. And now the forest wants revenge." The journal explained how the forest used its victims. It would break them down slowly, using their bodies to feed the trees. That's why the trees looked so strange, with those face-like shapes in their trunks. They weren't just shapes, they were real faces, frozen in wood. As I read this, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my boss. "4 more hikers missing in Whispering Pines. Need you to check it out." I looked out the library window. The sun was starting to set, painting the trees in dark shadows. I knew I had to go back to the forest, but this time I wasn't going alone. I called in a search party, experienced rangers and rescue workers. I thought having more people would make it safer. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. Back at my office, I started putting all the pieces together. Those 89 missing loggers hadn't just vanished. They had become part of the forest itself. I spread out all my photos on my desk, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The roots I'd photographed weren't just moving through the ground. They were connecting everything. Like a giant web under the earth, it linked every tree in Whispering Pines. I found a soil sample report from 1988 that nobody had looked at closely before. It showed something impossible. The dirt around the trees contained human DNA. Then I remembered something from Sarah Foster's journal about how the forest shared its victims. I pulled out my microscope and looked at a piece of bark I collected. What I saw still gives me nightmares. The wood wasn't normal. It had tiny veins running through it, just like human blood vessels. The forest doesn't just kill people, I wrote in my notes. It uses them. Their bodies feed the trees, and their blood flows through the whole forest like sap. That's when my phone rang. It was one of the missing hikers' families. They found something, a video on their son's phone, automatically uploaded to the cloud just yesterday. My hands shook as I played it. The video was dark and shaky, but I could make out trees moving in ways trees shouldn't move. The hiker was running, breathing hard. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "The trees, they're following us." The video ended with a sound I'll never forget, like wood creaking, but almost like words. I called Dr. Martinez, a scientist friend who studies plants. I sent her some photos and samples without telling her where they came from. An hour later, she called back, her voice shaking. Paul, she said, whatever these samples are from, it's not natural. The cellular structure, it's like the trees and human tissue have combined somehow. I've never seen anything like it. Right then, my office lights flickered. Outside my window, I saw the search party arriving. 12 experienced forest rangers ready to help me investigate. They were good people, the best at their jobs. I didn't know it then, but I was about to lead them to their deaths. We entered the forest at sunrise, me and 12 of the best rangers in Washington state. I tried to warn them about what I'd learned, but how do you tell trained professionals that trees can eat people? They just nodded politely, probably thinking I'd been working too hard. Everything seemed normal for the first hour. We spread out in teams of 2, staying connected by radio. I was with Mike, an experienced ranger who'd been doing rescue missions for 20 years. He was telling me about his daughter's soccer game when our radio suddenly crackled with static. Team 3, come in, a voice said. We found something. Wait, the ground is. Then silence. We'd all ran toward their last known location. That's when I noticed the air had gotten weirdly still, like right before a big storm. The trees seemed to be closing in, their branches making a ceiling above us that blocked out more and more sunlight. Everyone, get out now, I screamed into my radio, but it was too late. It started with the ground moving under our feet. Not like an earthquake, more like something waking up. Roots burst through the dirt, wrapping around legs before anyone could run. The trees, God, the trees just bent down, their branches reaching like hands. Mike pushed me hard, sending me rolling down a small hill. Run, he yelled. That was the last time I saw him. As I tumbled down, I heard screams from every direction. Through the trees, I caught glimpses of people being pulled into the earth or lifted into the branches. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. Behind me, I could hear wood creaking and splitting, and a sound like thousands of leaves whispering all at once. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. 12 people went into Whispering Pines that morning. I'm the only one who came out. The official report says it was a massive sinkhole that opened up suddenly. They said my teammates fell in and the ground collapsed on top of them. Search teams with the latest equipment couldn't find any trace of them. But I know the truth. They're still there in the forest. Part of it now, their bodies feeding the trees, their blood flowing through those twisted roots. Sometimes at night, I think I can hear them whispering in the wind, warning others to stay away. I quit my job after that, moved far away from Washington. But every now and then, I get photos from other forest rangers showing trees with strange shapes in their trunks or reports of missing hikers near old logging camps. And I know the hunger of Whispering Pines is spreading. If you're ever hiking in Washington state and you come across a forest where the trees seem to watch you, where the branches reach down too low, and where the ground feels like it's breathing beneath your feet, run. Run as fast as you can, because the forest is always hungry and it's waiting for its next meal. My name is Michael White, and this happened to me back in 1991 when I moved to Alaska with my family. Sometimes at night, I still wake up shaking, not from the cold, but from remembering what we found in that cursed ice. I kept quiet about it for years, but I need to tell someone. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. We were so excited when we first bought that old property near the Arctic Circle. The price was surprisingly low, but now I know why. My wife Sarah, our twins Emma and Ethan, they were 10 then, and I had always dreamed of living somewhere different, somewhere pure and untouched. We had no idea how untouched that land really was, or what secrets it had been keeping frozen beneath our feet. It was during our first month there, while we were digging to fix a broken pipe. The ground was mostly frozen, but we needed running water, so I kept going. That's when my shovel hit something that wasn't ice or dirt, something that looked like leather? No, not leather. Skin. Preserved human skin. I remember calling Sarah over, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but I wasn't. As we carefully cleared away more ice, we found an entire body, perfectly preserved. The face looked peaceful, like they had just fallen asleep. But their clothes, they were unlike anything we'd seen before. really old, made from animal skins and decorated with strange symbols. That would have been scary enough. But then Emma shouted from a few feet away. She found another one. And then Ethan found more. By sunset, we had uncovered 15 bodies, all preserved like they'd been frozen yesterday. Some looked peaceful, but others had expressions of pure terror on their faces. I called the authorities right away. They said they'd send a research team, but it would take a few days because of the weather. Those were the longest days of our lives. Every night, we could hear cracking sounds coming from the ice beneath our house. And the twins, they started talking in their sleep, in a language none of us understood. If only I had listened to those warning signs. If only we had packed up and left right then. But how could I have known? How could anyone have known what we were about to wake up? The morning the research team arrived, Emma looked at me during breakfast and said something that still haunts me. "Daddy, the people in the ice aren't dead. They're waiting." The research team arrived in 3 big white trucks. 8 people in total, 4 scientists, 3 assistants, and their leader, Dr. Peterson. They set up their equipment in the area where we found the bodies, putting up bright lights and tents. I remember thinking how those lights made the ice glow in a way that didn't look right. That first night, while the team was working, I found something in our basement, an old, worn journal. It belonged to someone named Robert Baker, who had lived in our house 30 years ago. His handwriting got messier and more frantic as I read on. He wrote about hearing voices from under the ice, about his children acting strange, and about ancient spirits that needed to be fed. I should have shown that journal to Dr. Peterson right away. Maybe things would have turned out differently if I had. The next morning, 2 of the assistants didn't show up for breakfast. Dr. Peterson and I went looking for them. We found their tent empty, but there were scratches on the inside, like they were trying to claw their way out. And the ice around their tent, it had turned dark red. That same day, my kids started acting weird. They would stare at the research team for hours without blinking. Emma told one of the scientists, "You'll look pretty when you're frozen." Ethan wouldn't stop humming this strange tune that made my skin crawl. Things got worse fast. Over the next 3 days, we lost more team members. We found one frozen solid inside her sleeping bag, even though she was right next to a heater. Another one just disappeared, leaving only footprints that led to a crack in the ice and then stopped. Dr. Peterson was trying to radio for help when she found something huge. The ground scanning equipment had shown there was a massive cave under our house, filled with ice. And in that ice were hundreds of bodies, all arranged in a circle like some kind of ritual. That night, I heard the twins talking in their room, but the voices weren't theirs anymore. They were deep and ancient, speaking words that made the windows frost over. When I opened their door, they both turned to look at me at the exact same time. Their eyes had turned completely white, like frozen milk. "The old ones are hungry, Daddy," they said together. "They've been waiting so long, and now it's time to feed them again." I grabbed the phone to call for help, but as I dialed, I heard Dr. Peterson scream from outside. When I looked out the window, I saw something that made my blood freeze, something that still gives me nightmares every single night. Through the window, I saw Dr. Peterson standing completely still in the snow. Her arms were stretched out, and ice was slowly crawling up her legs. She wasn't screaming anymore. She couldn't. The frost had already covered her mouth. I ran to Baker's journal again, my hands shaking as I read more. Now it all made sense. 30 years ago, Baker had moved here with his family, a wife and 3 children. They found the bodies too. But there was more, so much more. According to the journal, this land was once used by an ancient tribe. Every 100 years, when the longest night came, they would make sacrifices to keep the ice spirits happy. If they didn't, the spirits would wake up hungry and take whoever they could find. Baker's last entry was the scariest. He wrote about how his kids started talking in strange voices, how they would stand over his bed at night, their eyes white as snow. One morning, he found his wife frozen solid at the kitchen table, still holding her coffee cup. The next day, his children disappeared into the ice cave below. He wrote that he could hear them calling to him, begging him to join them. The journal ended there, just stopped mid-sentence. I ran upstairs to check on Sarah and the twins. The kids' room was empty, but the floor was covered in frost, even though the heating was on full blast. I followed their footprints down to the basement. They led to a part of the wall that had cracked open, revealing a dark tunnel going down into the ice. Sarah was already there, staring into the tunnel. "I heard them calling," she whispered. "They're down there, Michael. Our babies are down there." I shined my flashlight into the tunnel. The beam hit something that made my heart stop. Hundreds of bodies frozen in the walls of a massive ice cave. Men, women, children. Some looked hundreds of years old, others more recent. I recognized Baker's children among them, their faces peaceful like they were sleeping. That's when I heard Emma and Ethan's voices echoing up from below. "Come join us, Mommy and Daddy. The old ones want us all to be a family, forever." Sarah took a step toward the tunnel. I grabbed her arm, but her skin was already ice cold. She turned to look at me, and I saw that her eyes had started to turn white too. I pulled Sarah back from the tunnel with all my strength. She fought against me, her body getting colder by the second. "The children," she kept saying, "they need us." That's when I heard the footsteps coming up from the ice cave. Emma and Ethan emerged from the darkness, but they weren't my kids anymore. Their skin was pale blue and frost covered their hair. Their white eyes glowed in the dark like frozen stars. "Don't be afraid, Daddy," Emma said, but her voice sounded like cracking ice. "The old ones have shown us everything. They've been here longer than people, longer than time." Ethan reached out his hand. Wherever his fingers touched, ice crystals formed in the air. "They're so hungry, Dad," he said. "They've been sleeping for 100 years, waiting for the right family, our family." I watched in horror as Sarah walked over to them. Frost was spreading across her face like spider webs, but she was smiling. She'd hugged our children, and where they touched, her body started to freeze even faster. "Michael," she said softly, "it doesn't hurt. It feels like falling asleep on a cold winter night." I backed away toward the stairs, but ice was creeping up the walls. The whole house was freezing from the inside out. Through the basement windows, I could see more people approaching. The missing research team members. They walked stiffly, their bodies covered in frost, their eyes glowing white like my children's. "The search party will be here soon," Emma said, still wearing that terrible smile. "More people to join our family." 14 more, Ethan added. "The old ones told us exactly how many are coming." The temperature kept dropping. I could see my breath coming out in thick clouds. My fingers were starting to turn blue. Part of me wanted to give in, to join my family in their frozen embrace. Maybe it really was like falling asleep. No, I had to fight it. I had to warn the search party. But as I turned to run up the stairs, I heard a deep rumbling from beneath the house. The walls shook, and cracks spread through the ice like lightning. "They're waking up," my children said together. "The old ones are finally waking up." Sarah stretched out her frozen hand to me. "Stay with us, Michael. Be part of something ancient, something forever." Behind them, in the dark of the ice cave, I saw something moving, something huge, and I realized the ancient spirits weren't just controlling my family. They were breaking free from their frozen prison. And they were hungry. I ran up the basement stairs, my legs feeling heavier with each step. Behind me, I could hear my frozen family following, their feet making crackling sounds on the ice-covered steps. The whole house was now like a giant freezer. Through the front window, I saw headlights approaching. The search party had arrived. I wanted to scream to warn them to stay away, but my voice was nearly frozen in my throat. I watched helplessly as 14 people got out of their vehicles, their flashlight beams cutting through the dark. "Hello? Dr. Peterson? Mr. White?" they called out, walking closer to the house. The temperature dropped even more. I could see the air itself freezing, tiny ice crystals floating like evil stars. Emma and Ethan appeared at the windows, their white eyes glowing. They pressed their small hands against the glass, and beautiful but terrible frost patterns spread out from their fingers. "Look, Daddy," Emma whispered. "They're right on time." It happened so fast. The search party members didn't even have time to scream. The ground beneath them cracked open, and something dark and ancient rose from the ice, shapes I can't even describe, made of shadow and frost. They moved like smoke, but left trails of ice in the air. One by one, the search party members froze where they stood. Some tried to run, but the ice caught them, crawling up their bodies like hungry vines. I watched in horror as they all turned to ice, their faces locked in expressions of terror. Then I felt something cold touch my shoulder. It was Sarah, my beautiful Sarah, now completely frozen but somehow still moving. "It's time," she said softly. "The old ones say you're the last one, Michael, the final piece." I looked at my family, my wife and children, their bodies made of living ice, their eyes glowing with ancient power. Behind them, those dark shapes swirled and twisted, reaching for me with fingers of frost. That's when I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The cold tried to catch me, ice crystals forming on my clothes, in my hair, on my skin. I could hear my children laughing behind me, a sound like breaking icicles. I made it to my truck. The engine fought against the cold but finally started. As I drove away, I looked in my rearview mirror. My family stood in front of our house, waving goodbye. Around them, the search party members stood like ice statues in the snow. And above them all, those ancient dark shapes twisted up into the night sky. That was 30 years ago. I never went back. But sometimes on the coldest nights, I get letters. They're written in frost on my windows, messages from my frozen family. They tell me they're waiting, that the old ones are patient, that someday I'll come home and join them in the ice. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I swear my eyes are starting to turn white. My name is Robert Baker, and this happened to me back in 1968. I was just a young researcher then, fresh out of college and eager to make my mark in historical studies. What I found in those woods of Maine still haunts me today, and I need to share my story so others can stay away from that cursed place. It all started when I was working on my first big research project about old hunting practices in New England. I kept finding strange references to this one lodge deep in the Maine woods. The locals didn't like talking about it much, but I could tell they knew something. Every time I brought it up, they'd get real quiet or suddenly remember somewhere else they needed to be. But I was young and stupid back then. The more people avoided my questions, the more I wanted to know. I spent weeks digging through old town records, looking at yellowed newspapers, and reading dusty journals in the library basement. That's where I found the first real clue, a small note in a hunter's diary from the 1700s. It talked about sacred hunting grounds and blood rituals that the native tribes used to perform there. I remember sitting in that dimly lit basement, my heart beating faster as I kept reading. The writer described how the tribes would gather there every hunting season for some kind of ceremony, but something about the way he wrote it fell off. He seemed scared, and his usually neat handwriting got messier and more frantic as the entry went on. That should have been my first warning, but instead, I got excited. This was exactly the kind of historical discovery I had been dreaming of. I decided to visit the lodge myself to see what else I could find. The locals told me the place belonged to some rich guy named Reynolds who died a few years back. Getting permission to study the property wasn't too hard. Seems like nobody else wanted anything to do with it. The day I first drove up to that lodge, the sun was setting behind the trees. I still remember how the old wooden building looked against the darkening sky, like it was watching me. Even my old truck's engine seemed to get quieter, like it was afraid to make too much noise. I had no idea then that I was about to uncover one of the darkest secrets in Maine's history, or that my simple research project would lead me to something so terrifying that it would change my life forever. The lodge looked normal enough at first, just an old two-story wooden building with a big front porch, the kind you'd expect rich people to use for hunting trips. But something felt wrong the moment I stepped inside. The air was heavy, like right before a storm, and it was colder than it should have been even with no heating. I set up my research space in what used to be the living room, spreading out all my papers on an old oak table. That's when I found the first newspaper clipping, stuck between some floorboards. It was from 1962, talking about a hunting accident where two men had died. Nothing seemed weird about it until I found another clipping, and another, and another. Over the next few days, I dug deeper into the lodge's history. The previous owner, James Reynolds, had owned the place for 15 years. During that time, 27 people had died in hunting accidents on his property. 27. That's not normal. Most of them were his guests, people he'd invited up for hunting weekends. The police had investigated, of course, but Reynolds always had perfect explanations. They got lost in the woods. They accidentally shot themselves. They fell into a ravine. Everything seemed just believable enough that no one could prove he'd done anything wrong. But here's the thing that really got to me. I found Reynolds' old journal hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. The entries started normal, talking about hunting trips and maintenance on the lodge. Then they changed. He started writing about voices in the woods, about how the land was hungry, how it needed offerings. The last entry still gives me chills. It said, "I understand now. The land has chosen me. It needs them. It needs their blood, just like it needed blood hundreds of years ago. I am its servant now." I should have left right then, but I didn't. I was too caught up in trying to understand what had driven Reynolds mad. Was it just guilt from killing all those people, or had he really heard something in these woods? That night, I heard it too. A soft whisper coming from outside my window, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. I told myself it was just the wind in the trees. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The wind doesn't whisper your name. The next morning, I decided to check the local town records again. I needed to know what had happened on this land before Reynolds owned it, before the lodge was even built. What I found made my blood run cold, but that's when things started getting really strange. The town records were kept in an old basement room that smelled like wet paper. As I dug through the files, my flashlight beam caught something interesting. A really old map from the 1700s. It showed the area where the lodge now stood, but it was marked with strange symbols I'd never seen before. The librarian, Mrs. Thompson, saw me looking at it and got real quiet. "You're studying the Reynolds place, aren't you?" she asked, her voice shaking a little. Then she told me something that changed everything. That land wasn't just any piece of forest. It was an ancient burial ground. Over 200 Native Americans were buried there, all victims of a terrible massacre that happened in the winter of 1742. According to the records, the tribe used that land for special hunting rituals. They believed the forest spirits would bless their hunts if they followed certain rules. But one winter, a group of settlers broke those rules. They hunted without permission, killed too many animals, and when the tribe tried to stop them, well, things got ugly. The settlers attacked at night, killing everyone, men, women, and children. They buried the bodies right there in the forest. The weird thing was, after that, those same settlers started disappearing one by one during hunting season. Every year, like clockwork. I took all this information back to the lodge with me. That night, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The floor in the lodge's basement had these strange marks carved into it. They matched the symbols from that old map perfectly. The lodge hadn't been built here by accident. Someone had chosen this spot on purpose. As I was examining the marks, my flashlight started flickering. Then I heard something that made my heart stop. Footsteps upstairs. Heavy footsteps, like someone wearing hunting boots. But I was alone in the lodge. I knew I'd locked all the doors. The footsteps moved across the ceiling, heading toward the basement stairs. I stood there frozen as they got closer and closer. Then I heard something else, whispers, lots of them, in a language I didn't understand. They seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Suddenly, my flashlight died completely. In the pitch darkness, I heard the basement door creak open. That's when I remembered something else from Reynolds' journal, a warning about never staying in the basement after dark. But it was too late now. Whatever was coming down those stairs wasn't human, and I was about to find out why this land had claimed so many lives. I ran up those basement stairs faster than I've ever moved in my life. Just as I reached the top, I heard a scream from outside, a real human scream. Through the window, I saw flashlight beams moving in the forest. A group of hunters had come into the woods, probably looking for a good spot for tomorrow's hunting season. I counted 12 lights moving through the trees. I wanted to warn them, to tell them to get out while they could, but something kept me frozen by that window. The air felt different, like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. Then the screaming started. It wasn't just one scream this time, it was many. The flashlight beams started moving wildly, racing through the trees. I watched in horror as, one by one, they began to go out. Pop, 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 like candles being blown out by an invisible wind. The hunter's shouts echoed through the forest. Help! Oh God! Run! Then silence. Complete silence. Even the crickets and owls had gone quiet. My hands shaking, I grabbed my phone to call the police. No signal. Of course there wasn't. I ran to my truck, drove like crazy until I got into town, and told the sheriff everything. They searched the woods all night and the next day. What they found was worse than anything I could have imagined. The scene was like something from a nightmare. 12 grown men, experienced hunters, all gone. They found hunting gear scattered everywhere, broken rifles, shredded backpacks, torn clothes. But the weirdest thing was the trees. Every tree in that area was covered in deep claw marks, but they weren't from any animal the police had ever seen. And there was blood, so much blood that it had soaked into the ground, turning the soil black. The only survivor was a kid named Tommy, just 19 years old. They found him the next morning, hiding in a hollow tree. His hair had turned completely white. When they got him to talk, what he said matched the strange things I've been finding in my research. He told them about shadows that move by themselves, about ancient chanting in the darkness, about how the trees themselves seemed to come alive. But most importantly, he talked about the water. He said they'd all drunk from a stream near the lodge, and after that, everything changed. That's when I remembered something crucial from Reynolds' journal, something about the water sources around the lodge being marked by the tribe centuries ago. I knew then that I had to go back one last time. I had to find that journal again and read every single word. The answer to all of this, the deaths, the disappearances, the ancient curse. It was all there in Reynolds' last warnings about the water. But going back meant facing whatever lived in those woods, whatever had just claimed 12 more victims for its endless hunger. The next morning, I went back to the lodge one last time. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I unlocked the door. The place felt different now, like it was watching me, waiting to see what I'd do next. I found Reynolds' journal right where I'd left it, and this time, I read every single page carefully. What I learned made everything finally make horrible sense. Reynolds had discovered the truth about the water, but it had driven him crazy. The streams around the lodge weren't just water. They were part of the tribe's ancient ritual sites. According to Reynolds' notes, the tribe had blessed these waters hundreds of years ago. They believed that anyone who drank from them during hunting season would be marked for sacrifice. It was their way of protecting the forest, making sure no one took more than they needed. But after the settlers killed the tribe, something changed. The blessing became a curse. The water now did something to people who drank it. It connected them to whatever dark thing lived in these woods. Reynolds wrote about how he could hear it calling to him after he drank from the stream, telling him to bring more sacrifices. That's why he invited so many guests to hunt. He wasn't just killing them, he was feeding them to something ancient and hungry. As I read this, I remembered something that made my blood freeze. Yesterday, while walking around the property, I'd taken a drink from one of those streams. Suddenly, I heard it, that whisper I'd been hearing in my dreams. But this time, I could understand the words. It was asking for blood, for sacrifice, for hunters. The voice was in my head, but also in the walls, in the floor, in the very air around me. I finally understood why Reynolds had killed all those people. He hadn't gone crazy. He'd become a servant to whatever lived in these woods. I ran out of that lodge and never looked back. I moved away from Maine the very next week. But every year, when hunting season comes around, I hear about more disappearances in those woods. The police never find anything. They don't understand that the forest itself is hunting now. I'm sharing this story as a warning. If you ever find yourself near those woods in Maine, don't drink the water. Don't hunt on that land. And if you hear whispers calling your name in the dark, run. Run as fast as you can, because once the forest marks you as its servant, it never lets you go. Sometimes at night, I still hear those whispers, even though I'm hundreds of miles away. In every hunting season, I feel this urge to go back, to bring others with me, to feed the hunger that lives in those woods. That's why I had to write this down, to warn others before the curse claims me completely. Because I know that someday it will call me back to that lodge, back to those dark woods where the ancient hunger still waits. My name is James Cooper, and this happened to me back in 1955. I never wanted to share this story, but after what I've seen, people need to know the truth about what's lurking in the empty spaces of Wyoming. I was just a regular ranch hand back then, working wherever I could find work. This story begins when I took a job at the old Murphy Place, a sheep ranch about 40 miles outside of Casper. The pay was good, too good, really, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just happy to have steady work. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quiet everything was. Now, Wyoming's always been quiet, but this was different. No birds singing, no coyotes howling at night. Even the sheep seemed quieter than usual, like they were trying not to draw attention to themselves. Old Man Murphy gave me a small cabin on the edge of his property. Keep your eyes open at night, he told me. And whatever you hear, don't go outside after dark. I laughed it off then. Figured he was just being a paranoid old rancher. God, I wish I'd taken him more seriously. It was on my third night there that I found the first mutilated sheep. What I saw didn't make sense. The cuts were too clean, too precise. No wolf or mountain lion could do that. But that was just the beginning. I didn't know then that I was about to stumble onto something that would haunt me for the next 40 years. I started keeping a journal that night. Seemed like the sensible thing to do. Never imagined it would turn into a record of the most horrifying secrets of this region. Secrets that some people would kill to keep buried. Over the next few days, more sheep started disappearing. But it wasn't like normal predator attacks. You see, when wolves take a sheep, they leave a mess. These sheep just vanished. Except for the ones we found later, laid out in perfect circles in the fields, cut open like someone had done surgery on them. I started talking to other ranch hands in the area. At first, they'd clam up, looking over their shoulders before walking away. But after a few drinks at the local bar, they'd whisper stories. Stories about families that just disappeared overnight, leaving their clothes in their closets and food still warm on their tables. That's when I started digging deeper. I'd ride out to these abandoned ranches during daylight hours. Each place told the same story. Empty houses with no signs of struggle, but something felt wrong. Like the air itself was holding its breath. In one home, I found a family photo where all the faces had been scratched out. In another, there were half-finished letters begging for help. One evening, as the sun was setting, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The Johnson family, who lived on the neighboring ranch, was sitting on their porch like they did every evening. But something was off. Their movements were too stiff, like they were wearing their skin like ill-fitting clothes. When Mrs. Johnson turned to wave at me, her smile stretched way too wide, wider than any human mouth should go. I rode back to my cabin as fast as my horse could run. That night, I heard screaming from their direction. The next morning, the Johnsons were gone, just like all the others. I started keeping track of the disappearances. It wasn't random. It followed a pattern. Every month, at least 3 people would vanish, always when the moon was darkest, always leaving behind empty homes that nobody in town wanted to talk about. The thing that really shook me happened on a cold October night. I was checking the fence line, something I knew I shouldn't do after dark, but I had to find out what was happening to our sheep. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was just a group of ranchers having a meeting in the moonlight. But as I got closer, hiding behind a fallen tree, I realized something was horribly wrong. These things looked like our neighbors, but they moved all wrong, like their joints bent in ways they shouldn't. I watched, frozen in fear, as they gathered around something on the ground. It was another sheep, but what they were doing to it. They weren't eating it like animals. They were harvesting it, carefully peeling away its skin like you'd peel an orange. Their fingers were too long, too sharp. And they were talking, but not in any language I'd ever heard before. That's when I noticed the pile behind them. At first, I thought it was just old clothes, but then I saw a human hand sticking out. These things weren't just killing livestock, they were taking people too, and they were wearing their victims' skin like suits. I must have made some noise, because one of them turned its head, all the way around, like an owl. Its eyes, they weren't human eyes. They glowed like copper pennies in the dark. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, Didn't stop until I was locked inside my cabin. The next day, I started going through old newspapers at the library. What I found made me sick. Over the last 80 years, 167 people had vanished from ranches in the area. The papers called them accidents or runaways, but I knew better now. I knew what had really happened to them. I started looking closer at my neighbors after that night. Things I'd ignored before suddenly made sense. Like how Sheriff Miller never seemed to age. He looked exactly the same as he did in a photo from 1920 hanging in his office. Or how the Whittaker family's kids never got sick, not even a cold, for the past 30 years. The worst part? I figured out why these creatures needed 3 people every month. They couldn't keep wearing the same skin for too long. After about 4 weeks, their stolen faces would start to slip. I'd catch glimpses of something else underneath when they thought nobody was watching. That's when I got an anonymous letter from the White family. They lived on the oldest ranch in the county, and they knew what was going on. They'd been watching and documenting everything for generations. The letter said they had proof, photographs, journals, even recordings. They wanted to meet me at midnight to share everything. But when I got to their ranch that night, I was too late. The front door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Inside, the house was empty. On the kitchen table was a leather journal with a note that said Rune. I grabbed it and left as fast as I could. What I read in that journal, it changed everything. The White family had discovered that nearly every rancher in our county wasn't human anymore. These things had been slowly taking over for almost a century, replacing one family at a time. They had a whole system, which families to take, when to do it, how to cover it up. The journal's last entry was the worst. It said these creatures weren't just hiding among us anymore. They were planning something bigger, something that would let them take over not just our county, but everywhere else too. They started coming for me 3 days after I found the journal. First, it was just little things. My horses getting spooked for no reason, strange scratching sounds on my cabin walls at night. Then I started noticing them watching me. Every time I went to town, I'd see them standing perfectly still, just staring, not blinking, not breathing. One morning, I woke up to find my own face in the newspaper in the obituary section. According to the paper, I had died in a tragic farming accident. That's when I knew I had to leave. But they were smart. They'd already blocked all the roads out of the county. Every time I tried to escape, I'd somehow end up driving in circles, always ending back at my cabin. The night before I finally got away, Sheriff Miller came to visit. He stood at my door with that too wide smile and asked me to come down to the station. Said there were some concerns about my behavior. Behind him, I could see others gathering in the darkness, dozens of them, all wearing familiar faces, all moving in that wrong way. I managed to escape through my back window while they were breaking down my front door. I rode hard through the night on my last horse, clutching the White family's journal. Behind me, I could hear them making sounds no human throat should make. I made it out of Wyoming, but I know they're still spreading. Every now and then, I see news stories about quiet little towns where people start acting strange, where families disappear without a trace, and I know they've gotten there too. I'm old now, and I don't know how much longer I have. That's why I'm writing this all down. You need to know what's out there. If you live in a small town and notice your neighbors acting odd, if people start disappearing, don't wait around to find out more, just run. But whatever you do, don't trust the ranchers, especially if they smile too wide. Because now you know what I know. They're not all human anymore, and they're still hungry. My name is William Patterson, and this happened to me last summer when I inherited my Aunt Margaret's old house in Vermont. I wish I had never stepped foot on that property. I wish I had burned those journals the moment I found them. But now that I know the truth, I feel like I have to tell this story, if only to warn others. It all started when I got the call about Aunt Margaret's death. I hadn't seen her in years, not since I was a kid. She was always the odd one in our family, living alone in that big house with its massive garden. Mom used to say Aunt Margaret was married to her plants, and I guess in a way that was truer than any of us could have imagined. When I arrived at the house, everything looked normal at first. Well, as normal as a creepy old Victorian house can look, the paint was peeling, the windows were dusty, and the garden was something else. Most people let their gardens get weedy when they're old, but Aunt Margaret's garden was perfect. Too perfect. The plants were bigger and greener than any I'd ever seen, even though she'd been dead for 2 weeks. That should have been my first warning sign, but I was too busy thinking about how much money I could get for the property. See, I was in debt, and this inheritance seemed like a gift from heaven. I had no idea it was actually an invitation to hell. That first night in the house, I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, like before a storm, and I could have sworn I heard something moving in the garden. Not like animals or the wind, more like the sound of things slithering and stretching. When I looked out the window, I saw the plants swaying even though there wasn't any breeze. I told myself I was just tired from the drive. I didn't know then that what I was seeing was just the beginning of a nightmare that had been growing in that garden for over 30 years. I started cleaning up the house the next day, trying to ignore the weird feeling I got every time I looked at the garden. While sorting through Aunt Margaret's papers in her study, I found old newspapers stuffed in a drawer. At first, I thought they were just junk, but something caught my eye. They were all about missing people. The first article was from 1945, local teen vanishes near Thompson property. Then another from 1947, young couple missing after evening walk. And another, and another. All of them were about people who disappeared near our property. I spent hours reading through them, and my hands started shaking when I realized there was a pattern. Every spring, someone would go missing. Sometimes it was kids, sometimes adults. The police never found them. The articles got yellower and older as I dug deeper into the drawer. But they all told the same story. People just vanished without a trace. I remember sitting there, surrounded by these newspapers, when I heard a sound from the garden. It was like someone dragging something heavy through dirt. My heart started beating fast, and I went to the window. The sun was setting, and in the dim light, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The plants were moving. Not just swaying, but actually moving their stems and leaves like fingers reaching for something. I backed away from the window and bumped into Aunt Margaret's old desk. That's when a hidden drawer popped open. Inside was a thick, leather-bound book with dark stains on its cover. I picked it up, and as soon as I'd opened it, I knew my life would never be the same. It was my aunt's diary, and on the first page, written in her neat handwriting, were the words, "The garden must be fed." The diary fell open to a page with a list. A list of names. 18 names, each with a date next to it, each marked as fertilizer. I recognized some of those names from the newspaper articles. Looking back now, I should have run right then. I should have called the police or just gotten in my car and never looked back. But I had to know the truth. I had to understand what my aunt had done. And that's when I started reading her diary, not knowing that with each page, I was getting pulled deeper into something darker than I could have ever imagined. Reading Aunt Margaret's diary was like falling into a nightmare, only I couldn't wake up. Her first entry was from 1945, right after she moved into the house. She wrote about how excited she was to have such a beautiful garden, but then things got weird. "The roses spoke to me today," she wrote. "They're hungry. Always hungry. I tried regular fertilizer, but they want something else. Something special." Then came the entry that made me sick to my stomach. She wrote about Tommy Wilson, a kid who used to throw rocks at her windows. One night, she caught him in the garden, but instead of calling his parents, she watched as the plants, I can barely write this, the plants grabbed him. She described how the vines wrapped around his legs, how the roots came up from the ground, and how the garden drank him in. The worst part, she wasn't upset. She was happy. The roses bloomed so beautifully the next day, she wrote. Now I understand what the garden needs. Page after page, she wrote about the gifts she gave the garden. Sometimes people would wander onto the property at night. Other times, she'd invite them in for tea. 18 people in total, each one becoming what she called fertilizer. She kept little souvenirs from each person. A button, a hair clip, a watch. I found them all in a box next to the diary. But there was something else in her writing, something that scared me even more. She talked about how the garden was getting stronger, how it was starting to hunt on its own. She wrote warnings too. Never go into the garden at night. Don't listen when it calls your name. Don't look too long at the flowers. They can see you back. The last few pages of the diary were different. Aunt Margaret seemed scared. She wrote about dreams where the garden showed her its true home, some kind of ancient place where things like this garden had always lived. She said our garden was just a doorway, a portal to somewhere else, somewhere hungry. Her final entry gave me chills. I thought I was controlling it. I thought I was feeding it. But now I know it's been growing stronger all these years, and soon it won't need me anymore. God help whoever owns this land after I'm gone. As I finished reading that last page, I heard something scratch against my window. When I looked up, a vine was pressing against the glass, its leaves spreading out like a hand, and I swear, just for a second, I saw it wave at me. After reading about Aunt Margaret's victims, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking there had to be more to the story. That's when I remembered old Mr. Jenkins, who used to take care of the garden before Aunt Margaret bought the house. Mom had told me stories about him when I was little, but she never said exactly what happened to him and his family. So I went to the local library to look through their old newspapers. What I found made my hands shake so bad I could barely hold the paper. In 1944, just before Aunt Margaret moved in, Mr. Jenkins had killed his whole family, his wife, 3 kids, and even their dog. The newspaper said he had gone crazy one night, but his statement to the police was what really got to me. The garden was hungry, he kept saying. It showed me things, beautiful, horrible things. It promised to show me more if I fed it. But it wasn't enough. It's never enough. The police found him in the garden, covered in dirt and blood, planting something. He was laughing and crying at the same time, telling the officers that the flowers would bloom so pretty now. They took him to an asylum, where he died a few months later. His last words were a warning about the garden. It'll keep eating. It'll never stop eating. I dug deeper and found out something even creepier. Before Mr. Jenkins, 5 other families had owned the house. Each time, something terrible happened. One family just disappeared overnight, leaving their dinner still warm on the table. Another family's kids went missing one by one until the parents went crazy with grief. Each time, the garden kept growing bigger and stronger. While I was reading all this in the library, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my neighbor next to the house. Your garden is growing into my yard. The vines are breaking through my fence. Please come fix this. I rushed back to the house, and what I saw stopped me cold. The garden had grown huge overnight. Vines as thick as my arm had crushed the fence, and the flowers, that were enormous, with petals that looked almost like faces, and they were all turned toward me, like they were watching, waiting. That's when I heard screams coming from behind the house, young voices, teenagers, and I knew, somehow, that the garden was done waiting for someone to feed it. Now it was going to feed itself. I ran toward the screams as fast as I could. Behind the house, I saw 3 teenagers, 2 boys and a girl. They must have snuck in to explore the creepy old house, like kids often do. But now they were in the middle of the garden, and what I saw next will haunt me forever. The plants were moving like they were alive, not just swaying, but actually reaching for the kids. One boy was already caught, vines wrapped around his legs. He was screaming and trying to pull free. His friends were frozen in fear, watching as more vines slithered toward them like snakes. Run, I yelled, grabbing a shovel from the ground. I ran into the garden, swinging at the vines. The plants made this awful hissing sound when I hit them, and something dark and thick, like blood but not blood, oozed out of them. I managed to reach the boy and started hacking at the vines around his legs. That's when I felt something wrap around my own ankle. I looked down and saw a root had broken through the soil, curling up my leg. The ground itself was trying to pull me down. The girl screamed, "The flowers! Look at the flowers!" The roses had turned to face us, and in the center of each bloom was something like a mouth, lined with tiny, sharp things that looked like teeth. They were opening and closing, making soft smacking sounds. I finally cut the boy free, and we all ran for our lives. We didn't stop until we were out on the street, all of us breathing hard and shaking. The kids were crying, and I was too, because now I had seen it with my own eyes. What Aunt Margaret wrote about, What drove Mr. Jenkins crazy? The teenagers were lucky. They only had cuts and scrapes. They begged me not to tell their parents, afraid they'd get in trouble for trespassing. But I made them promise to never come back, to warn their friends to stay away. They didn't need much convincing. That night, I sat in my car across the street, watching the house. The garden was moving more than ever, like it was angry we had taken its food away. And through my aunt's old bedroom window, I saw something that made my heart stop. Words being written in the dust on the glass. "We're still hungry, William." I knew then I had to end this, had to figure out what this garden really was, because those kids weren't the last ones it would try to take. The garden was getting bolder, stronger, and hungrier. And somehow, I knew it was all building up to something much worse. After saving those kids, I knew I had to solve this once and for all. I went back to Aunt Margaret's study and searched every inch of it. Behind an old painting, I found a hidden safe. Inside was another diary, older than the first one, with pages so yellow they crumbled when I touched them. This diary wasn't my aunt's. It belonged to the very first owner of the house, from 1902. As I read it, my whole body went cold. The garden wasn't just a garden, it was a door, a gate to somewhere else. This place had always been special, long before any houses were built here. Native Americans had warned the first settlers to stay away, saying the ground was hungry here. The diary told how the first owner had done a ritual to wake up the garden, thinking it would make his crops grow better. Instead, he opened something that should have stayed closed. The garden became a doorway to what he called the feeding grounds, an ancient place where things like these plants came from. Every person the garden took wasn't just killed, they were pulled through, sent to that other place. As I read this, the whole house started to shake. Outside, the garden was going crazy. The plants were growing huge, bursting through windows, breaking down walls. The ground split open, and from deep below came this weird purple light and sounds. Sounds like screaming, but not human screaming. I grabbed the diaries and ran outside. The garden was transforming. The flowers had grown as big as cars, their petals spreading open to show those horrible mouths. Vines were shooting up into the sky, and in the center of the garden, the ground was sinking, making this giant hole filled with that purple light. That's when I finally understood. All these years of feeding the garden, all those victims, they weren't just food. They were sacrifices to make the doorway bigger, and now it was big enough. I saw things starting to crawl out of that hole, things that looked like plants but moved like animals, with teeth and claws made of thorns. They were coming through from the other side, ready to spread beyond our garden. I knew what I had to do. I ran to the garage and grabbed every can of gasoline I could find. I didn't care about the house anymore, or the inheritance, or anything else. This had to end. I threw the gas everywhere and lit a match. The garden screamed, actually screamed, as it caught fire. The flames spread fast, and that purple light started flickering. The things trying to crawl out shrieked and pulled back into their hole. The fire grew higher and higher, and I swear I could hear voices in it. All the voices of the people the garden had taken over the years. I watched it burn all night. By morning, there was nothing left but ashes. The hole was gone, the doorway closed. I called the fire department and told them it was an accident. They believed me. After all, old houses catch fire all the time. I'm writing this now from a hotel far away from Vermont. I've sent copies of the diaries to people I trust, just in case something happens to me. Because even though I burned it all down, I can't shake this feeling that somewhere in that other place, those things are still hungry, still waiting, and maybe, just maybe, they're looking for another door to open. So if you ever buy a house with a beautiful garden, and the plants seem to grow too well, and at night you think you hear them moving, run. Run as fast as you can, because some gardens don't just grow flowers, they grow nightmares. My name is Frank Miller, and this happened to me back in 1957 when I was working as a fur trapper in Montana. I still wake up screaming some nights, thinking about what I saw in those mountains. Maybe writing it down will help, but I doubt it. Some things just stay with you forever. I was 32 then, living alone in my cabin near the Bitterroot Mountains. Being a trapper meant spending lots of time by yourself. checking your trap lines in the woods, skinning animals, and trying to make enough money to get through the winter. It wasn't an easy life, but I loved the quiet and freedom of it. At least I did until that February morning when everything changed. The day started like any other. It was freezing cold, with fresh snow on the ground that crunched under my boots. I headed out at dawn to check my trap lines, carrying my rifle and wearing my warmest coat. But something felt off right from the start. The woods were too quiet, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. I remember thinking how strange it was that I hadn't caught anything in my traps for 3 days straight. That had never happened before, not in all my years of trapping. The animals seemed to have vanished, like they knew something I didn't. Then I found Pete's body. Pete Johnson was another trapper who worked the area north of my cabin. We weren't close friends, but we'd share coffee sometimes and help each other out when needed. What was left of him was arranged in a circle, like some sick decoration. I won't describe exactly what I saw. Those images are burned into my brain, and I wouldn't wish them on anyone. But I knew right away this wasn't done by any person or animal I'd ever heard of. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I wanted to run, but I knew I had to document what I found. Someone had to know what happened to Pete. As I got closer, I noticed strange marks carved into the trees around the circle. They looked ancient, like something from those old Indian stories my grandfather used to tell me about the evil spirits in the mountains. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning. Pete was only the first victim of whatever dark thing had come to our mountains, and soon I would learn exactly what it meant to be truly hunted. Maybe I should have left right then, packed up my things and never looked back, but I didn't. God help me, I stayed. And that's why I'm still here, trapped in this endless nightmare, forced to tell you my story so you'll understand what's coming. Because it's spreading, you see. The circles are appearing everywhere now. After finding Pete, my first thought was to get help from Timothy, my closest neighbor. Tim lived about 2 miles away, and we'd often look out for each other during the harsh winter months. I practically ran the whole way there, my breath making white clouds in the cold air. But when I got to Tim's cabin, something was wrong. His door was wide open, swinging in the wind. Tim would never leave it open like that, not in February when every bit of warmth counts. I called out his name, but only silence answered back. Tim, you there? It's Frank. My voice sounded small and scared, even to me. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was how cold it was. The fire in his stove had gone out long ago. Tim's coffee cup was still on the table, half full and frozen solid. Next to it was his journal, open to his last entry from 3 days ago. He'd written about hearing strange noises at night, like singing but not quite human. That's when I saw the blood trail leading to his bedroom. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I followed it. I'd seen plenty of blood before. It's part of being a trapper, but this was different. This wasn't just drops. It was like something had been dragged. What I found in Tim's bedroom made me sick to my stomach. He was laid out just like the animals in our traps, but arranged in that same awful circle pattern I'd seen with Pete. Around him were more of those strange marks carved into the floor. They looked fresh, like they'd been made the same day. I ran outside and threw up in the snow. When I could finally think straight again, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, footprints in the snow. But they weren't normal footprints. They started from nowhere in the middle of Tim's yard and disappeared the same way, like whatever made them had dropped from the sky or risen from the ground. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts my dreams. It was like a whisper, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't English, wasn't any language I'd ever heard, but somehow I understood what it wanted. It was calling me to join some kind of hunt. I ran back to my cabin as fast as I could, grabbed my radio, and tried calling for help. But all I got was static and more of that awful whispering. I was trapped up there with whatever this thing was, and I was starting to realize it had plans for all of us trappers. The worst part? Deep down, I was beginning to feel a strange pull toward those whispers, like some dark part of me wanted to answer their call. And I knew, somehow, that I wasn't the only one feeling it. Other trappers in these mountains were hearing it too, and soon we'd all be pulled into something terrible that none of us could escape. Over the next few days, more trappers went missing. I found their bodies one by one, each arranged in those horrible circles. The first was old Bill Stevens, who'd been trapping in these mountains longer than anyone. Then the Anderson brothers, Mike and John. Each scene was worse than the last. I started keeping a diary of everything I found. Looking back, maybe I was trying to stay sane by writing it all down. Here's what I noticed. Every circle had exactly 7 marks carved around it. The bodies were always facing north. And strangest of all, we'd all started catching fewer and fewer animals in our traps, like the forest was emptying out. One evening, while I was heating up some soup, someone knocked on my door. It was Sarah Cooper, one of the few women trappers in the area. She was shaking and pale. "Frank," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been seeing things, hearing things. Please tell me I'm not going crazy." I let her in and made her some coffee. As she warmed up, she told me about the whispers she'd been hearing. They were the same ones I'd been hearing every night. "It's like they're calling us to something," she said, staring into her cup. "Like they want us to hunt." "But hunt what?" I asked, even though deep down I was afraid I knew the answer. That's when we heard it, a low humming sound coming from outside. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. Through my window, we saw lights dancing in the woods like fireflies, but bigger and moving in perfect circles. "We should check it out," Sarah whispered, and I could hear the pull in her voice, the same pull I'd been fighting for days. "No," I said firmly, grabbing her arm. "That's what it wants. Whatever's out there, it's trying to draw us in." We stayed up all night, listening to those whispers getting louder and louder. Sarah told me about an old book her grandfather had, filled with stories from local Indian tribes. They spoke of an ancient spirit that would visit every 100 years, demanding sacrifices through a ritual hunt. "But those are just stories," I said, not believing my own words anymore. Morning came and Sarah left to check her trap lines, promising to come back before dark. She never did. I found her the next day, arranged in another circle, her face frozen in a look of terror. The worst part was the journal we found in her pocket. She'd written about feeling compelled to join some kind of ceremony in the woods. The last entry simply said, "The hunt begins tonight. I can't fight it anymore." That's when I realized we weren't just victims. We were being chosen. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just killing trappers. It was turning us into something else. And with each death, those whispers in my head got stronger, calling me to join what they called the Great Hunt. I knew then that I had to warn someone, anyone, about what was happening in these mountains. But as I write this, I can feel myself changing. Those marks I keep finding, they're appearing on my skin now. And the whispers, they're starting to make sense. A week after Sarah disappeared, the remaining trappers in the area gathered at my cabin. There were 6 of us left: me, Jack Parker, the Wilson twins, Dave Thompson, and Mary Collins. We all had the same strange marks appearing on our skin, and we all heard the whispers. "We need to get off this mountain," Jack said, showing us the dark symbols that had appeared on his arms overnight. It looked just like the ones around the circles we found. "I tried," Mary said quietly. "Drove my truck down the mountain road yesterday. Engine died halfway down. When I got out to check it, I felt like something was pulling me back up here. My legs just started walking on their own." The Wilson twins nodded. They tried hiking out 2 days ago, but ended up walking in circles, somehow always coming back to the same spot. That's when we saw it for the first time. It was standing outside my cabin window. I can't properly describe what it looked like because my mind doesn't want to remember. But I can tell you it was tall, taller than any person should be. And it seemed to be made of shadows and antlers and too many eyes. "Welcome, hunters," it said in our heads. Its voice felt like ice running down my spine. "You have been chosen for the great hunt." Dave tried to run. He made it 3 steps before freezing in place, like a puppet on strings. "You cannot leave," the thing said. "The circle must be completed. The hunt must begin. You will chase, or you will be chased. Choose." We all felt it then, a horrible urge to grab our rifles and start hunting. But not animals. No, it wanted us to hunt each other. "Why us?" I managed to ask. "You are trappers," it answered. "You understand the hunt, the chase, the kill. Now you will learn its true meaning. The thing reached out with what might have been a hand, and suddenly all our hunting knowledge felt twisted. Every trap setting skill, every tracking ability we'd learned over the years, it was being turned into something evil. Tonight, it said, you will begin. One will survive to continue my work. The others will feed the circle. Then it was gone, but we could still feel it watching. We'd all looked at each other, knowing what was coming, but not wanting to believe it. We can fight this, I said, but my hands were already reaching for my rifle, just like everyone else's. Mary started crying. I can feel it in my head, she whispered. Like all my hunting instincts are taking over. But wrong. So wrong. The sun was setting, and with each passing minute, we could feel ourselves changing. Our minds were filling with dark thoughts about hunting each other, about completing the circle, about feeding whatever hungry thing was out there in the woods. Lock me in the cellar, Jack suddenly said. Quick, before I can't control myself anymore. But we all knew it wouldn't help. As darkness fell, we could feel the hunt beginning. Our bodies were ready to move, to chase, to kill, whether we wanted to or not. The last normal thing I remember was looking at my friends and saying, I'm sorry. Then the night took over, and the real horror began. What happened that night still feels like a horrible dream. But the blood on my hands when I woke up was real enough. The hunt began as soon as the moon rose. We all scattered into the dark woods, moving like animals instead of people. I could feel everyone's presence in my mind, like dots on a map. That thing had turned us into both hunters and prey. I remember running through the trees, my feet somehow knowing where to step even in the pitch black. The skills I'd used for years to track animals were now being used to track my friends. I didn't want to do it, but my body wasn't listening to me anymore. I heard Mary scream first. She'd been caught in one of Jack's traps, the same kind we used to catch wolves. Before anyone could help her, the Wilson twins appeared from the shadows. What they did, I can't write it down. But I heard that thing's voice in my head saying, the first offering is made. Dave Thompson was next. He climbed a tree to hide, just like he taught me to do when hunting mountain lions. But his breathing gave him away. I could hear it like it was right next to my ear. The thing made me point him out to Jack. Together, no, I can't describe it. But Dave's body became another part of the circle. One by one, we hunted each other down. With each death, the circles on the ground grew stronger, glowing with a sickly light. The marks on our skin burned brighter too. We were becoming less human with each kill. I found Jack later, standing over what was left of the Wilson twins. He looked at me with eyes that weren't his anymore. Frank, he whispered, fighting against whatever was controlling him. End this, please. I raised my rifle. My hands weren't shaking anymore. When the sun rose, I was the only one left. 12 bodies lay in a perfect circle around me, arranged just like I found Pete that first day. Their blood had drawn strange patterns in the snow, and those patterns seemed to move when I looked at them too long. That thing appeared again, standing in the middle of the circle. Well done, Hunter, it said. You have proven yourself worthy. I felt the last piece of my humanity slipping away as the marks on my skin began to glow. The knowledge of what I'd done, and what I would have to keep doing, settled into my bones like ice. The circle must continue, it told me. You will help me gather more hunters, more trappers. The ritual must grow. Then it was gone, leaving me alone with what I'd done, but not really alone, never alone again, because now I can feel other trappers out there in other parts of the country, and I can feel myself being pulled toward them, drawn to start new circles, to continue this twisted hunt. I'm writing this down as a warning, while I still have enough of myself left to care. If you're a trapper, and you start finding strange circles in the woods, run. Run as far as you can. Because if you see me coming, it's already too late. The hunt will have begun. That was 3 months ago. I'm not sure I'm really Frank Miller anymore. At least, not the Frank who used to just trap animals and live a quiet life in the mountains. I've been traveling since that night, moving from town to town, state to state. Wherever there are trappers, I feel pulled to go there. What's left of my human mind fights it, but the pull is too strong to resist. Last week I was in Oregon. Found a group of trappers there, just like me and my friends used to be. Simple people trying to make a living. I watched them from the woods, fighting against what I knew I had to do. But when night fell, I started carving those circles, started whispering the words that would call that thing to them. In my backpack, I keep a journal I found in Idaho. Another trapper wrote in it before he became part of a circle. He'd seen the same things in Minnesota and heard about similar circles appearing in Maine. We're spreading it, those of us who survived the hunts, like a disease moving across the country. Sometimes I meet others like me, the ones who lived through their circles. We don't talk much, just nod and keep walking, knowing what we've both done and what we'll keep doing. Our skin glows with those strange marks now, and our eyes don't look human anymore. I'm writing this final entry in a small diner in Wyoming. There's a group of trappers who work in the hills nearby. Tonight, I'll go to them. Tonight, another circle will begin. I can already feel that thing smiling in my head. If you're reading this and you trap animals for a living, remember these warnings. If your traps start coming up empty for no reason, if you find strange circles carved in the ground, if you hear whispers in the woods that sound almost like words, if you see a tall figure made of shadows and antlers, if you meet a man whose skin glows with strange marks, then run. Run as far and as fast as you can, because it's spreading, this curse or whatever it is. The circles are appearing everywhere now, and someone like me, someone who used to be normal but isn't anymore, is coming to start a new hunt. I have to stop writing now. The sun is setting, and I can feel the pull starting again. The trappers in these hills don't know it yet, but their circle is waiting to begin, and I don't have any choice but to help complete it. This is Frank Miller, or whatever is left of him, signing off. If you find this journal, share it. Warn others. Maybe someone can stop this thing before it spreads across the whole country. But hurry, because every night, somewhere in America, another circle is being drawn. Another hunt is starting. And we're always looking for more trappers to join us.